We're very excited to have you here for a conversation between Paul Seawright and Colin Davidson about his work, Beasts of Burden, which is currently in the gallery and will be here until the 12th of December. Just a couple of housekeeping things. There are no scheduled fire alarms this evening, so if one goes off, please exit out the front. If you'd like to use the restrooms, they are behind this wall up the lift and straight ahead. We are operating a one-way system, so if you do go upstairs, please use the stairs down the side here to come back down. Directly after the talk at 7, there is an exhibition opening upstairs by Sheila Chakravarty called Default is White, about racism in Northern Ireland. You're welcome to stay and see that exhibition as well. We'll have about 45 minutes of speaking and then a couple of minutes Q&A. Thank you for coming in and welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So thanks all for being here tonight. Paul, a Paul Seawright exhibition in Belfast is a rare thing. In fact, the last time I think you showed here in Belfast, it was in the museum, 2015.
2015.
Yeah, and so we're very fortunate within 6 years to have one more. So on behalf of everybody here, thank you for showing this work here. No, I mean, talking about here, Paul, which is now very much home for you. If you don't mind going back and just, I mean, you and I have known each other for a fairly long time now, but to go back and talk to me about the formative aspects of your career. What first lit that spark? What first sparked you to lift the camera up and start to document things in your own way? Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, there's probably two key points, and they're both quite different. The first, I suppose, is the moment when I fell in love with the idea of the camera and the darkroom, and making photographs. And I was only in third year at school when that happened. And as I think often is the case for us, you look back on those times in your life, and you can identify a person who they will have no idea it happened, but they unlocked something at a certain moment. And we had this teacher who came to the school, Belfast Royal Academy, from Canada. He was a new art teacher. I arrived that summer, and in the corner of our art class, he'd built a darkroom. It was a new thing. And at the back of the room, we had a pile of these Silver Time life books on the history of photography, one on documentary, one on landscape, and so on. And I just loved it. I loved the process. I loved the idea of taking photographs. And my dad had always taken photographs, not in a serious way, but he'd always had a couple of cameras. He was always putting film through the camera. He'd asked me to photograph him a number of times. And kind of at that same time, I was very interested in the music scene here. I was into the punk scene. You remember in the kind of very late 70s. At the same time, I got interested in photography, and I used my camera for that. So I just found a folder recently, and there's photographs in it of like Debbie Harry and in the Ulster Hall and Susie and the Banshees, all that kind of stuff. So just using my camera as a young teenager to reflect some of that stuff. Nothing serious. But in love with the process of it, I think, became the thing, and being creative through that. I'm rubbish at drawing and painting, and although I did
I haven't seen his work, by the way.
I did foundation art and design. We had some great laughs about my efforts in the life room with Neil Shawcross and David Crone, my tutor at that time. But the probably real pivotal moment, Colin, was that when I eventually left to go to art school to study photography, I couldn't do that here. The art school didn't have photography except as an aspect of fine art. So I went away to England to art school. And it was at that moment where a number of things happened, really, really crucial. And it's why I make the case for, if people say, well, why would you want to go to art school to do photography? Everyone takes photographs, and everyone knows how to make photographs. And it was there that I learned how to construct photographs, how to use photography in a really purposeful way, how to think about meaning in photographs, how you construct meaning in photographs. By studying, at that time Victor Bergen had just published this book called Thinking Photography, which was all around a kind of theory and a reuse of some art theories in photography and in representation that made me look at photographs in a way I'd never looked at before, and made me think, actually, photography is an amazing vehicle, not just to do what you love doing, but to actually do something that might or could be important, or do something beyond itself. So that coming together of the medium, being able to play with the medium and camera formats and all the stuff I kind of enjoyed with how you would use it to construct meaning and do something purposeful. Like before I'd went to art college, all my work was very much landscape, very romantic, and very much about process. And within less than a year of being at art school, it was very political. It was very much it was elements of autobiography, reflection on where I'd come from, the issues that I'd faced growing up in Belfast and in a working class area, sectarianism. All of that started to come into my work at art school, and that probably is the real pivotal moment where, the way I would describe it to students often, is where I found my subject.
Yeah.
And my subject, largely people would say my subject is kind of conflict and social fracture, but actually my subject is me.
Yeah.
And my own experience, and my subject is Belfast. And although this work is in Rwanda, and I've made work in many different countries, I often say that ultimately I'm always making work about Belfast.
Doesn't all art that we make, if it's as honest as it's possible to be, and if it's as truthful, I think I agree with that with all art, that ultimately it is about us. And ultimately, it's about where we're from as well. Obviously, what you're saying, and I want to come on and talk specifically about this, because that's effectively why we're here. But I want to touch on as well, Paul, some of the things you were talking about there, which obviously are linked with you starting to understand at that stage, whenever you were away in art school, you're starting to get a grasp of the power of art, and actually where photography used in the arena as a fine art is different and speaks in a different way than documentary photography. What documentary photography to me says is it leaves no room for us to interpret. It is basically telling us the facts. It's basically spelling it out to us.
Making a case quite often.
Absolutely.
Taking a position.
Whereas what you were discovering back then is the fact it's the gaps that are left. It's the room that is left in the photographic work of art for the viewer to fill those gaps. That's where the understanding really can occur. Talk to me a bit about how you developed that from art school and the understanding of that in the subsequent years, because I know that you came back here and you did a piece of work, a groundbreaking piece of work here that in some ways launched your career.
Very much so.
Talk to me about doing that and the sectarian murder piece of work.
Yeah, I mean, when I've always talked about my work, I've been very clear to say that there was an element of what happened in terms of the trigger point about making that sectarian murder work as the final piece of work I made for graduating from Farnham. And it was very much about how you reflect back through your work on the process of leaving here, even though it was temporarily. Of course, I was coming back for Christmas and summers and so on. And that distance from a place where I'd really never left Belfast in any way, and that distance, of course, allowed for a reflection that was really quite a visceral moment for me. It was interesting when you realise that you're from a quite a contested place. Now, it seems ridiculous to say that, given that you've grown up in that, but until you leave it, you don't really reflect on just how bizarre our society was in the 1980s. And
not just leaving it as well, looking back in retrospect now, you can understand that.
Yeah, indeed. If you pick up, there's so many of these books around now, and you pick up these books of photojournalists who'd made work during that time, and you look through them, you look at it and you think, wow, did we live like that? It is quite extraordinary. But but I kind of became very, very interested, and I hadn't been interested at all in the conflict here. I'd only been interested in music, to
Yeah.
be perfectly honest. And I suddenly became really interested in it. I was in secondhand bookshops in Guildford buying Penguin classics on internment and
Yeah.
you know, all kinds of stuff, and devouring the history. I'd met Catholics for the first time. You know, Sean McGuire, good friend of mine, filmmaker. You know, we met in the first week of college and had such an amazing moment where he had grown up in Derry in a 100% Catholic area. I had grown up in Belfast in a pretty much Protestant area. We really hadn't ever had discussions. And the discussion with him, the realization that his history and my history and our understanding of his history was just like here and here, you know, just opened up a desire by me to understand it for myself. So I started buying all these books. I became interested in the photojournalism of the Troubles and the way it had been photographed, mostly from outside in this kind of quasi-colonial way, where people had come and seen here as an easy way to go and make conflict pictures and fly into Belfast, stay in Europa, make some pictures of riots and bonfires, and then leave again. And I became very angry about all that, and thinking, you know, it's such a much more sophisticated issue,
Yeah.
and you know, being from here and starting to understand that and talking to different people, it was quite frustrating. So I remember talking to a tutor about it, Paul Graham, who had made some work here, landscape photographs of Northern Ireland, and actually I wasn't particularly happy about him coming to do that either.
Okay.
But actually that work was a gateway project to my own work, and he said, you know, Paul, don't get frustrated, make some work. You know, you are from there, so make work about that experience. So I took a diary that I'd kept in 1981, the year of the hunger strikes, and I used that diary, and I went back to the sites that I talked about in the diary and made photographs, and then used the text from the diary with the photographs to create this kind of, because of course what I've been writing in the diary was about the experience of being a teenager, you know, about going to the youth club and trying to impress girls by taking apart a Rubik's Cube and putting it back together again, and all this kind of stuff. And in the same diary entry, it would maybe say something like, a milkman and his son were killed in Twadell Avenues today, or the Pope's been shot, you know, or you know, whatever. And it was mixed in with things like went to the Royal Avenue Cinema to see Scanners X, you know, with Sammy, and then something after that that was quite political. And then making these photographs, and it was very much the precursor to sectarian murder. So it was very subjective, very much about using my own experience as a way to reflect on the world. And photography, people often say, is this window on the world, you know, and that journalism just shows us things and, you know, reflects back what happens. But that's not true, because the photographer has a massive role to play in how that's done. And Don McCullen and I, you know, the famous photojournalist, were on a panel together in Sweden once, and he was arguing with me about this, and he was saying, you know, I am an objective witness of world events, and Paul, if you had been where I was and we stood together, we'd have made the same picture. And it's just not true. Absolutely not true. And I've experienced that. In fact, I did a series on the Orange Order, and Ed Cashy, who's a fabulous National Geographic photographer from San Francisco, he was here that same summer making work, and we kept bumping into each other, became good friends. In fact, they ended up doing a joint exhibition at the Arts Council Gallery in Bedford Street. And you couldn't have seen two different projects. I mean, what we both produced was, you know, not just formally different, but conceptually very, very different. And I think so much of what I've done in the sectarian murder work was very much about how you take your personal experience and reflect that through an issue or an event or a series of things that are challenging. And with sectarian murder, it was very much about how do you present the enormity of the conflict on, you know, in terms of its impact on society, as a really humanitarian issue, to get through all the political fog that people who looked from outside, and people I spoke to as a student would say to me, I don't understand it, and surely everybody who's, you know, gets killed over there is probably involved in the conflict somehow. But of course that's not true. So I wanted to present it as a much more human issue. And you know, you have the same experience with your silent testimony project. You know, it's about how you use art to re-pivot people back from something they think they understand to make them re-look at it in a different way. And really ever since I made that first piece of work and saw how it engaged people with something that they'd become uninterested in. And you got to remember in the late 80s when that was made, 88, people had had enough of Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
People talked about compassion fatigue, that they didn't really want to see anymore in the media. It was so repetitive.
Yeah.
Killing after killing, bomb after bomb. How many images of a building exploding or a car exploding can you look at? So it was an attempt to try and turn people back to it, to really think about it again and think about it in a different way. And I think all the projects I've worked on are trying to do that.
Yeah.
And not deal with it directly like the photojournalist might, where you try and give all the answers and explain away the situation. No, you're just asking someone to come back to the subject, re-engage with it, and hopefully go and do a bit of further research and understand what the subject really is about.
Or just to engage with the work of art.
At an emotional level.
And to get some, I was talking to you about the cow there. I think from a personal point of view, that this is probably the strongest body of work that I've seen of yours.
Thank you.
And I think it's interesting that it's as much. I always see your work, and have through the years seen the human being as being central to it, even though the human being is off to the side and we don't see it. We don't see him or her, but it's humans. That is what it's about. And so I was talking to Paul beforehand about the image of the cow just as we come in, and saying that, like, I know that cow doesn't know what's going on. I know that cow isn't briefed and isn't told intrinsically what the process it is involved with. But whenever I'm looking at what effectively, and in my case is paint on a bit of cloth, in your case is ink on a bit of paper, whenever I'm looking at that, and it's an inert thing, I'm reading something into, I'm looking at that cow's eye, and I'm reading something into that. Okay? Now, I'm not saying that the cow knows, but what I'm becoming invested in why you did that, is what I'm trying to say. And it's all the more powerful, I think, in the human being ones here, the portraits, I suppose is what we would call them. And in some ways, as far as I know, this is the first time you've really ventured into specifically making portraits. And so everything in the exhibition informs everything else. Nothing can really be, whilst people can purchase a piece of work, or it might be seen in an exhibition, maybe 2 or 3 bits, it's one complete work of art. Yeah. It's not, so I understand completely what you're saying about that. Let's talk about this particular body of work, because I've been aware of your work. One of the key aspects after that exhibition, which we've talked about back in art school, was the commission from the Imperial War Museum, the Afghanistan work which you made. I was going to come on and talk about this, but let's just touch on that first. Did that bring the game on a wee bit more for you? Did you get an understanding? Did it inform the reasons in your mind? Did it solidify that in your mind as to why you made the work that you did? Because you were going into, making this sectarian murder work here. As you've said, we all, when we were growing up, had what we felt were normal lives. In Afghanistan at that time, it certainly wasn't that. What did you bring from your time here to that, and what did you bring from Afghanistan back to inform the rest of your work?
Such a key moment in my career. I can't believe it's 20 years ago that I was in Afghanistan. I can't believe that the Taliban are back in Afghanistan. because I was there just as the invasion was coming to an end, and when the Imperial War Museum contacted me to say you've been shortlisted one of 5 artists for the War Artist Commission for Afghanistan. Well, it was technically a response to 9/11 and the invasion of Afghanistan, and they have a commission for every conflict really since the First World War. And my first instinct was to say, absolutely not. You know, I've spent my career having to go at people coming to Northern Ireland from other countries to make work. So how can I go to Afghanistan? And of course, when I talked about it, a few people said to me, "Look, this is not something you can turn away from. So you've got to develop a proposal that would work for you." And actually, so the learning from that whole process was, how can I work in other contexts that aren't in Northern Ireland in a way that I feel ethically comfortable with, that I feel that I can still make work that is credible and authentic, that is connected back to me and to my interests in Northern Ireland, and doesn't do what I have often been critical of in terms of this kind of colonial, or, you know, go into difficult places as a kind of an exotic thing to do. The answer to that really was to deal with Afghanistan by not trying to deal with the specificity of the conflict, because I am no expert on the Afghan conflict or the invasion, now I know a lot about it because my work is all research driven. I mean, I've been an academic for the last 30 years, and that's an important aspect of, you know, how you underpin what you do with research. But it doesn't sit large in the work itself. So the work itself deals with the impact of conflict on place. It's very much about what happens when a war happens and leaves this devastation behind it. You know, land that you can no longer walk on because it's so heavily mined. You know, whole communities are displaced at the margins of former villages or towns, and that's what I focused on. Formally, making the photographs, an enormous challenge, because my work up until that point, if anyone who knows it here, had been very much about landscapes that were closed, dark, very Northern Irish, very grey, dark, closed, an occluded frame, no horizons. And here I am on the first day in Afghanistan with these massive wide open landscapes where there's nothing between the sky and the horizon, thinking, how am I going to make work here? It was a horrible panic moment. I'm here for a month to make this commission, and the kind of space I work in aren't here. Yeah. Once I'd kind of let myself, you know, deal with that and focus on the one bit I think that runs through every single project that I've done, photography is inherently about how well it describes things. You know, so the invention of photography, you know, and Fox Talbot's writing about photography in that first portfolio of photographs, you know, were all about how it was a brilliant tool for describing objects, could be brilliant for insurance purposes, you know, for here's the actual thing, not a drawing of it, but here's the actual object. You know, so that is photography's strength. It transcribes things very accurately. That cow, you know, you can see the detail of its hair and everything. It describes it really accurately. Now, I have then tried to kind of use the antithesis of that, the absence of description. Yeah. So the thing I want to talk about in the work is never described, is never photographed. It's always outside of the frame. And that's that idea of the subject being quite a difficult or invisible subject, and for it to sit outside the frame and be represented by something other than itself. So the violence is never described as something violent, but the violence is there and is described by things that then become a metaphor for that violence. So that's what happened in Afghanistan. I began to see the landscape and the hidden landmines, the hidden unexploded cluster bombs, as a way to talk about this invisible subject that kind of runs through all the projects.
And that's why your work, to us, to me, is about posing a question to the people who view it. You're not purporting to give an answer.
Definitely
and
not.
I think, in fact, I am dubious about any work of art that purports to give an answer. The answer can come whenever somebody engages with the piece, but the work in itself does not provide that. Sorry I jumped back a bit to talk about that, because I had intended to straight away talk about this. I want to talk about the why of this, And then I also want to talk about the how, because for me, it's interesting to find out as a photographer, as someone who is interested in their craft, as I am, to find out how you went about doing this. But first, Paul, and I also want to touch on something you said before, and maybe you can mention this as part of it as well. You said that, I'm paraphrasing a bit here, but you said that basically the reason or the story of why you're there making the photography or the piece of work is never overtly the subject of the photograph. How do you unpackage that when it talks? Because to me, this is the first time that you've got close. You're photographing the people themselves, and I'd be interested to hear what you mean by that, because for me, I am looking to a certain extent at the subject of.
Yeah, but you're looking at actual victims.
Yeah.
And actual perpetrators.
So
yeah.
talk to me about the why of this. Where did the germ of the idea come from?
Okay, so look, I had read. I'm a huge fan of Fergal Keane.
Yeah.
As I'm sure many other people in this room will be, and his book Season of Blood from Rwanda.
Yeah.
Published in 1994, 1995, when he took a journey to Rwanda as the genocide came to an end, is still one of the most moving books I've ever read. There's then a number of artistic projects about Rwanda that I've always included in my lectures about when I talk about art and conflict, which is I guess my research area. And one of those is Gilles Perez, and many of you will know Gilles Perez. You know, he's just published the most enormous book of his Northern Irish photographs that, you know, it comes in its own box. It's 3,000 pages or something ridiculous, you know, and is the most important photographer in terms of the representation of this conflict. All those bloody Sunday pictures that you'll know were all taken by Gilles. Gilles did a book in Rwanda called The Silence. It's a black-bound book, no text, just page after page of bloody horror. Yeah. It's really quite impossible to look at as a book. You know, a number of times I've tried to make slides of it to show in a talk, and it's even that's impossible. How do you start to even show a book like that when he even exhibits it? And I saw it exhibited once in Rotterdam at the National Photo Museum. He doesn't make any big prints of the pictures, because how could you make big prints, or why would you make big prints or beautiful prints of something so violent? And I say violent, like bulldozers shifting piles of bodies, and you know, classrooms and schools with children sitting on benches. The only thing left is their spine, you know. And the Perez book is a great example of what photography does. You know, it really is, I suppose, a document that does distill somehow what happened at that time. Yeah. It has the horror of it, but really it's not a thing you'll ever want to look at again. Yeah. Whereas if you read Fergal King's Season of Blood, which is a more poetic telling of the same thing, it's still a horrific read. Still a horrific read, but actually something you may want to look at again, and it has room in it, whereas the Perez book is just... Then there's this other piece of work by Alfredo Yar, who's a South American artist who, in fact, was a visiting professor at Ulster for a while. Brilliant artist, went to Rwanda to try and make work, always makes work about conflict. And he came back and, in a similar way, looked at all these photographs he'd made when he was there and thought, these photographs have an impossibility about them that I can't use them, they're useless. Because they're so beyond anything that should be represented. So he put them all in black boxes and wrote accounts of what he had photographed on the tops of the boxes, and exhibited these closed black boxes that nobody has ever seen the photographs inside them. And I think only Rwanda, the enormity of 1 million people killed in 100 days, you know, could present that issue. You can imagine for me, for years, 20, 30 years, it has occurred to me, how do you go and, you know, from my approach to conflict, how would you ever go to represent that? And actually, it's not enough just to go and photograph the sites and the genocide places. You know, that's a bit trite. So I never thought it was ever going to be possible. And then I heard about this project, and actually Fergal King's involved in a very similar project, and I heard about this project through the author Tony Macaulay, who'd been doing some work out there with Carsa, who run this project. In fact, I was at a dinner with Tony on one side and Brian Keenan on the other, and we were talking about this kind of subject, and he mentioned this, and it just dawned on me that the cows could be this powerful metaphor for all those things, because we slaughter animals, the animals will eventually be killed. We think about cows particularly in that context, and I thought, wow, there really could be something in this. And my first instinct would have been that there were no people pictures. The Paul Seawright pure approach to this would have been just a series of photographs of the cows with everything really sitting outside of the image.
Yeah.
But then I went to Rwanda. Sorry.
No, I mean, it really, I think, Paul, what is obvious is that this is, I know for a fact this has touched you deeply.
The experience of the people and their telling of what happened to them, and actually, Colin, their telling of the reconciliation is one of the most moving things you'll ever experience. So the first workshop I attended, in a green painted hut, and I have a fabulous photograph of it, but it's not a photograph made for the project. It's not a formal picture, so I've never used it. It's not in the book, and but it's a beautiful photograph. I think actually the organisation maybe used it on their website, and it's a picture of a man and woman, elderly man and woman, sitting side by side on a bench, and they told their story. It was the first time at one of the workshops, reconciliation workshops, where I heard them tell their story, and she told her story first. And she stood up, and through a translator then, and it would take too long for me to retell her story, but if I condense it, effectively what happened, the genocide had begun. She's in the village, she knows what's going to happen, she's a Tutsi, the Hutus have started the massacre. She has, I can't remember exactly, maybe it was 5 sons, and the leader of the village, the kind of, each village leader was a Hutu, had been her neighbour. They grew up together as children and had been her neighbour. And he came with a group of men to kill her and her family. And she begged him. She said, I was on my knees, this is how she described it, grabbing his feet, begging him not to be the one to kill them because we knew each other. I know you. And his concession was he let her run. And then they butchered her children. And so she survived that, as many people did, and lots of children survived by hiding underneath their dead family. But then she turned around and she said, and this is the man who killed my family. So then he stood up and he told his story, and he tried to explain. He didn't make excuses for it. He had been in prison for 25 years. He said, it's disgraceful what I did. I'm ashamed of what I did. You have to understand there was a frenzy and a peer thing going on that made this happen. But this workshop, he said, I thought was an impossible thing. She said the same. She said the second week of the workshop, the idea of even being in the room with him, he of course came back to the village after he's let out. Where else would he go? Of course he went back to the village. How can I live next door to this man? She said, he killed my family. He wiped them out. And she said, so I heard about this workshop, and I said, no way, I can't even look at him, never mind speak to him. And then I think it was him that said it. After the second week of the workshop, she knocked his door and said, are we walking up to the workshop? And she said, we have now raised 2 cows together. We have a shared vegetable plot. And she said, our lives are entwined, and we are friends.
It's incredible, Paul. Do they talk about the loss? Do they talk about the events?
Yeah.
So that's all addressed as part of this?
Very, very, very much so. It's about that kind of the process of telling. They talk about it like, and they bring these sacks of wood in and ask people to carry them around for a day on their back. And they're explaining to them that you're carrying that around, you're carrying your past, you're carrying the hurt around like this huge sack of wood, and you have to take it off you in order to be able to live. You have to ask the question, how is it possible to reconcile something so enormous? And the answer they give when you ask that question is, there was a national decision.
Yeah.
The whole country decided that because this touched the entire nation, that the entire nation had to decide that it wanted to reconcile.
Yeah.
And having made that decision, there's lots of ways that reconciliation has happened, and this is only one, I imagine, of many. But when you understand the impact of this on people, I mean, there's a young man down there who survived the man in the red hat, and his story is quite extraordinary because he was only a 3-year-old or a toddler, a small boy who had gone to the well in the village to get water, and the well's maybe a mile away, and by the time he came back with the water, he talked about spilling it and having to go back again, and he's a young boy, he'd been not focusing on the task at hand, and he got back to the village, and he said, as I came to the village, I thought, why are there no birds? And then he walked through the village and realised that everybody was dead when he was away. I think he was 3 or 4. He didn't speak till he was 13. And to understand why he didn't speak, I remember that he didn't tell me this, but I was speaking to one of the facilitators. They encountered typically the severed heads of their baby brothers and sisters, and this wasn't just about kill someone; they were mutilated. So to experience that as a child, you can imagine the trauma. Yeah. So he lived in the marsh, eating grass and drinking water for a month, maybe longer, and was eventually found by troops as they came in to liberate the villages. Didn't speak till he was 13 years old, and is an amazing advocate for the programme and for reconciliation. Quite extraordinary, such a extreme experience, and yet there he is trying to talk people into getting involved with the workshop with CARSA and reconciling.
So it's important for you, Paul, as an artist, that this work hangs here as well?
Yeah, I mean, there are connections to here.
Absolutely.
I mean, Seamus Heaney, and it's actually Fergal King who writes about this. Seamus Heaney wrote about neighbourly murders in the lanes and roads of Fermanagh.
Yep.
And how in this place, people who had bought and sold land off each other, had known each other all their lives, went out and killed each other.
Yeah.
They were neighbours, they were people who knew each other. It's exactly the same thing that happened. That somehow, and I heard it said once that, the wonderful David Irvine, who is now dead, I remember him describing it once on a documentary, a Peter Taylor documentary, and he said, it's not as if, he said, this mist came down that infected us all, and I went from being a Sunday school teacher to someone who could go out and murder, but the environment changed to such a degree that we did things that we never thought we were capable of.
Yeah. Rwanda,
that happened in an accelerated way, and in a way that was pushed by the Hutu government that legitimised it. They started paying people 3 times the price for crop picking, for murdering.
Yeah.
So it was just a context that made it possible for ordinary people to do extraordinary things, and there's an element of that what happened here, of course.
Absolutely. And I think that at what point, Paul, did you didn't fly out and set out at the outset to make the human photographs? At what point did you realise that this body of work, which is going to basically be photographs of cows, at what point did you realise, right, I'm going to need to put some of the people who've suffered loss into this?
When I had those conversations I've just described, when you stand in the same space with both perpetrator and victim, and you see them reconcile, you see them with this animal, and I thought, actually, that's just so extraordinary. I mean, so extraordinary that it had to be somehow represented. So, and I think it's the right decision, although it doesn't fit with my, I'm a landscape photographer actually. Each situation presents a new solution, and it presented itself very naturally when I was there. I made those photographs. I guess I would never have thought that it might have been possible to make those photographs at the same time, but as you went to each dwelling and met each person and they wanted to tell you their story, there was a connection that you could, you know, of course you had to make a picture of them, a photograph of them.
And I get that completely.
Yeah.
Knowing you, I get that completely. Seeing how much this has moved you, I get that completely as well, because this hasn't affected, making this work is unique to you in a sense that, you know, I haven't seen you be as emotive for any past body of work. And this obviously is something that you own and touched you.
You must have experienced exactly this when you were painting people in silent testimony.
Well, in some ways, there's parallels to an extent.
But when people told you their story, I mean, you're going to paint them.
Well, it was what I was going to ask you, and you know, I suppose to me it was a traumatic experience for me, because as I went to each home, I painted 18 people who suffered loss here. And as I went to each of the homes, and maybe I would sit in a bedroom that was kept as it was for the last 25 years, since I'm thinking particularly of a couple called Paul and Anne Riley, and their daughter Joanne was killed. She would have been exactly the same age as me. And Paul brought me up to Joanne's room, kept exactly as it was. Nothing moved since the day that she left it for the last time. And he sat for me in that room. And still as broken as he was at the very start. Unable to, this horrible term that's bandied about in this place, unable to move on. The perpetrator's not caught. No answers for him and Anne at all. The clock on the wall, there was a little pink girl's wall clock on the wall that she probably got for Christmas when she was a kid. And it was stopped at 2 minutes to 10, which was the time that the bomb went off. Paul talked about hearing the bomb go off in Warren Point. He was actually the caretaker of the school there. And the bomb going off shook the town. He said it was like a door closing. That was him explaining how it sounded. But in so many ways, it was a door closing for him. You cannot, in the you can't come away from that and not be changed. You can't come away from that as an artist and not pour the trauma of that back into your work. I sense from your work here, Paul, that you were using the making of this work as a therapy for yourself to deal with what you heard. You know, I look at every picture here and I see as well the trauma felt by the person who made this as well. And that is where its power is. It's where the power of art is. And that's what I did with my work. I was offered counselling by Wave, who helped me, and they introduced me to each of the 18. And I said, look, no, I'm not going to take counselling for this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use the work as my way to deal with it and pour the energy of the trauma, nothing on the level of trauma that people like Paul and Anne are ongoing feeling and having to live with now, but still traumatic in its own right. And you pour that into the work. And that's what I know when I am in this room, I know that there is something so much more going on in with the person who made it as well. It's not just a journey or a voyage for the people who we see. It's a voyage for you. And I mean, whenever you were making the work, Paul, physically making it, photographing it, setting things up, and I do want you to talk about the how of the whole thing as well. I think in some ways the how of it, I think we should talk about the how of it, but in some ways I don't mean to talk about it to trivialize what the subject actually is. I just wanted you to talk about the process of going there, finding the cows, finding the people who raised these cows, and actually photographing the things.
Yep.
How do you go? Because there is
with enormous difficulty.
Yeah, well,
let me tell you.
Talk to me about that from a practical point of view. How did you actually go about it? Because I've seen documentary photographs of you making this work, probably shot on iPhones and things, and you're walking nearly knee deep in mud. You've got this cow, and you're trying to put a panel behind the cow, where you're trying to show this grey background, and there's you with the tripod. It is bizarre.
Yeah, I mean,
so
you can see that's one of the pens in the picture of the man with the red shirt. You can just see that. So a typical dwelling will be a pen for the animal,
yep,
and a room exactly the same size on the other side for the family to live in, and a courtyardy bit in the middle. And on day one, when I arrived at the first home, and they said, "So what do you want to do?" And I said, "Well, we need to get the cow out of the pen." And they went, "Get the cow out of the pen?"
Yeah.
The cows never come out of the pen. So these cows live in a pen from the day they're born, sadly, to the day they die.
Okay.
Because if they come out of the pen, they would just they'd be away, So that was their first shock, and they started, getting these wooden stakes out of the way to get them out. And of course, the cow goes crazy, running around this tiny enclosed space. But we kind of worked out a way of doing it in the end, and it was very difficult and quite hilarious at sometimes. And it was a good way to connect with the people in the village, because of course they all thought I was a nutcase. The man with the camera trying to release the cows, and it was important though that the photographs had some kind of they're quite dignified. It was to give the cows some dignity, give them some presence, and actually to make them feel like a piece of art. The only way to do that was to make feel like you'd lifted them and put them in a proper photographer's studio. So it was to try and create that feel without it becoming too clean and too precious. So some of them you can see a bit of the dirt in the background and the fabric, and that's fine. And yeah, it's good that, I did think about putting those in the catalogue, the production things, because it is quite extraordinary when you see how difficult that was. But really, I think in an artwork, you just don't need to see how you produce your painting or how it's the mystery of that needs to exist.
You can explain away art.
You can,
I think, and you can. I think the text that comes with this art is important. I think as well. I think I'm right. This is the first time you've written an introduction to one of your own bodies of work.
I just wanted something that was short. We're probably going to be wound up, are we, Mark? We'll just finish off now. But look, there's this very fine line as an artist between giving not enough information that the piece of work becomes obscure and there's no way in, but you've got to give enough to allow people into the work to be able to react to it and understand it. And there is a tipping point, and often I talk about this with students, is about just finding that sweet spot between enough information and not too much information, because too much information that no longer has any longevity, does not require much work on the part of the person experiencing the artwork. You have to leave some space for the person who's looking at it, but not pull back so much that they can't access it. And the subject matter is so powerful, and it leads this work that you needed to have that piece of historical text
absolutely
as the intro.
Critical. Paul, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you,
It's
Colin.
been great to chat to you.
Appreciate you doing it.
Perhaps at this point, are we okay to take a few questions at this stage?
A couple of questions, good.
if anybody has any questions for Paul, I can field them, or Mark can field them. And
Bring the microphone just for the recording, if you wouldn't mind.
okay, so just raise your hand if you have anything you'd like to ask.
Well, you mentioned that the whole body of work is one piece of art, as opposed to the pictures being. Oh, sorry, I didn't hear myself. You see, sorry. You mentioned that the whole body of work is seen as one piece of artwork. That's correct, isn't it? That's
Yes.
That's certainly what you were coming through with. However, though, when you look at these pictures individually, is there one that would be your sweet spot that you say that would tell the story, as you know, that would kind of summarise it for you?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. It's a good question because I think it takes us back to Colin's question about the portraits. I've thought about, even if I wanted to hang one of these in my office at work, which one would it be? And actually, it's impossible to hang one of the cows without hanging one of the portraits, for example.
Yeah.
You do need the two. You know, and I've been round and round in circles about which one that might be, in terms of the animal. You know, I love this picture because it's so striking, it's strong. But actually, for me, and I know that I had never planned, that I'd never printed the first one, that first cow that has went. A lot of people say to me it's their favourite, but that one there has always been my favourite. That innocent calf, because it had just been gifted to, and this is not known by the audience, it had just been gifted to a perpetrator and a victim. It was their first animal. You know, a young calf, the circumstances of getting it out, and it stood there like a baby calf would stand there. I remember, you know, having my hand on it.
Yeah.
And in that image, that one image for me, the innocence of it, the innocence of that animal, is at such contrast to the meaning of the work, which is about the most extreme, unpalatable violence.
Yeah.
And yet the cow's meant to represent something about healing in that context. So it's kind of perfect for me in that regard.
Thank you. Thanks.
One more question.
You spoke earlier about the similarities between conflict in Rwanda and conflict here, and the way in which the whole country of Rwanda had bought in to the healing process and the moving forward. Do you think that that would be a substantial difference to how things would be envisaged as happening here?
I have always thought there's a huge opportunity for us to learn from what's happened in Rwanda in terms of reconciliation here. It couldn't be in the same way because for lots of reasons. One of them being that the way that justice was achieved through village courts that were set up at the time, because so many people had to be tried, thousands and thousands of killers, although many fled across the border to Tanzania and were given shelter in other countries. But the way that process worked, the whole village was involved in that process. There was an element of truth-telling in the justice process.
Yeah.
And I think that gave people closure, even back then, 25 years, 30 years ago when that happened. Then the second element is that the cow literally becomes not just a symbol of sustainability, it does help them sustain. It is a sustainable future for them. You know, owning a cow for two people in this situation is quite a thing. You know, so that's been gifted to them by the charity, and the charity helping them learn how to use that to get milk and cheese and other things is quite enormous. You know, so they begin to think that's the motivator to get them involved with the workshop, that this could be something that helps us survive, literally, and at that level, it allows an engagement that might not be possible here, and I do still think I really wanted to when we did this, we wanted to get Christoph, who runs the organisation, runs those workshops, to try and come, but with COVID, all that became impossible, and do an event at Stormont that was engaging some other people, and we might try to do something like that in the future, because I think any kind of reconciliation story here can help us, no matter if it seems that the context is wildly different. There's stuff for us to learn about how you reconcile with your fellow human being, no matter how awful they've been.
Here.
Paul and Colin, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was lovely and very, very insightful and affecting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.